Hey, hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to talk about the Omega Man. I have the DVD here. It's with this four pack of other science fiction movies of the era. But Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston. This was the second of the great trilogy of Charlton Heston science fiction movies. Of course, Planet of the Apes first, and Omega Man in the middle, and then Soylent Green came a few years later. So. This film is an adaptation of the Richard Matheson novel I Am Legend, which has been adapted a few times. It was made in the 50s with Vincent Price, the 70s version with Charlton Heston, and then in the 2000s, Will Smith. So it's been a novel that's been adapted. And basically, the story is about a lone survivor of a plague or a pandemic who must contend with zombies in most of the stories, although in this film it's mutants. I'll talk more about that. They're survival stories, but also stories about how will humanity survive in such an environment. And so it's an apocalyptic movie. Heston plays a doctor who survives the plague because he invented a vaccine at the last minute that cured him of, and the way it's showed in the movie, basically this makes people suffocate, whatever the contagion is. But it also has other effects too, where some people turn into so-called mutants who are a they're not zombies. Zo- they're sort of like zombies, but they're almost more like a cult where they're very anti-technology and want to destroy all the survivors of the plague, and we'll talk about that. So in the movie, we get some flashbacks of the pandemic, and we're with Heston when he's living by himself, trying to survive in the city in his apartment, and that's very entertaining parts of the movie where Heston is talking to himself, very funny lines. He's at one point he goes to a movie theater and watches the film Woodstock, the documentary about the famous concert. A little more to say about that. So it's Heston surviving on his own. And I should say, yeah, and eventually he runs into some other survivors, and the story goes from there. To make it brief. So this movie was directed by Boris Sagal, I believe, who was, I believe, more of a TV director for the most part. And but yes, he directed this film, and I say it's for a B movie. It's fairly well directed. Yeah, worked a lot in television. The script was by John William and um, Joyce Corrington wrote the script. I believe they were a husband and wife team who wrote this script. And yeah, and there's also in the film as Heston stars Heston. There's Rosalind Cash, who is one of the human survivors. There's Anthony Zerbe, who plays great character actor of the '70s, who plays the leader of the mutants. So great cast of the 1970s, and it's a survival movie in this post apocalyptic environment. And I think of about Heston. I'll talk about Heston a little bit here, where he's in this interesting point in his career where he's, you know, primarily known for his biblical roles like Moses and Ben Hur and movies like that. But he had done a lot of westerns, he'd done some film noirs, and he kind of got a niche with science fiction in the 1970s. And Heston's persona is interesting because I think my generation or people my age remember Heston as the very passionate Second Rights Amendment, from my cold dead hands, and became was head of the NRA, very outspoken about gun rights and things like that. And yet earlier in the 1960s, he was very outspoken about civil rights. He was one of the very visible celebrities on the March on Washington in 1963, and he was right. He was what we would think of as very liberal on many social issues. But as he got older, his politics changed, and in the 70s, he's in this odd place where I think you can see some of Heston's liberal sentiments in the movie, where we have a very diverse cast in the movie. There's an interracial relationship that Heston has with Rosalind Cash, who her character was modeled on as someone from the Black Power movement early in the decade, and there's also in this movie, like, this is an era where black cinema, black exploitation, the term used at the time. I don't think that term is used as much anymore, but movies made for black audiences, but we're also breaking through mainstream movies like Shaft and Superfly and many other films. But you start to see the influence of those movies into more mainstream movies, and the Omega Man is would be an example of that. So you have a diverse cast, and this theme of racial harmony in the film, where when Heston does meet up with the survivors, it is a fairly diverse group of people, as compared with the mutants, who are interestingly also diverse, but like I said, they're more like a cult than anything. Some comparisons have been made to the Manson cult of a few years before. So there is that. I guess there's like this very much this post '60s sentiment in the movie of the idealisms of the '60s are over, kind of symbolized by the scene where Heston is watching Woodstock, where he is kind of mocking the movie, but also seems to admire it in some ways. It's a very interesting scene, the way that plays, where he knows all the lines from the movie. Interestingly enough, I know this is where Joel Hodgson got the idea for Mystery Science Theater 3000, by the scene of Heston kind of doing a talking about the um, the Woodstock film. So that's an interesting part of trivia with this movie. But there's also this satiric tone to the movie as well, a little bit of the cynical tone that we more associate. There is an idealism sort of in this movie, but Heston's character gives voice to a cynicism running through the entire film. And so that was an interesting dynamic that was brought into the movie as well. And I think Heston's persona as playing biblical characters, and at one point in the film, a little girl asks him, "Are you God?" and he doesn't say anything. It's an interesting scene, but the idea, it's his persona has been so entrenched with biblical type movies, and I mean, in this film, at one point, his character is on a crucifix. Okay, and of course, you can kind of see where his character is going. This is very much a Christ-like arc with Heston's character in this film. So it is interesting how the film alludes to the past of Heston's movies and things like that, um, where he's and that kind of goes back to the novel I Am Legend, where the protagonist becomes like a I Am Legend, becomes a legendary figure, and this movie at least does follow those beats in the story. Yeah. So yeah, I think this movie, it's had, I think, more influence on pop culture. It wasn't reviewed well at the time, from what I can gather, but it was popular with young people. I have to think this movie played on like local TV stations a lot. in the 1970s, like your Saturday afternoon movie. So it gained a huge fan base. And there's action. It kind of turns into a fun B movie. It's by no means like the best of science fiction movies of the decade, but it's just a good B movie with if you like post-apocalyptic movies, it's very much there. And I think it's influenced movies like John Carpenter movies. Like I can see a direct correlation between this film and Escape from New York from the early 1980s, where you are in this more kind of desolate urban landscape that's filled with all these very dangerous people like the mutants in this movie. And then you have a protagonist who is cynical like Snake Plissken and anti-authoritarian and all those types of things. So you can definitely see this movie's influence, I think, going on to that pulpy tone of like a Carpenter movie. So yeah, entertaining movie, fun to watch. Very 1970s. This is 1971, but this feels very much like a 70s movie with its style and with its attitude. So, anyway, those are my thoughts on the Omega Band. Thanks for watching, and I will see you later. Bye.